Morning, everybody. Good afternoon if you're on the other side of the ocean. This is Emily Mazzacurati with 427. We are pleased to have you with us today for the next hour. We have a full agenda and a range of wonderful speakers. I will walk you through a quick overview as a start. The agenda for today includes quick introductions and context setting by myself and Dr. Niels Cox from GeoFi, who is also on the line. We'll tell you a little bit more about data and methodology of how we model climate risk in the real estate sector. Then we'll move on to present a few highlights of a white paper that we've recently published about real estate investment trust. And finally, we'll tie this conversation discussing how can physical climate risk considerations be integrated in TCFD reporting. And we have the pleasure of welcoming Chris Pikes from the U.S. Green Building Council and GRESB to share some thoughts with us about that. A couple of points of housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded. The slides will be available on the Insights section of our website, as well as on the GeoFi website. And we will take Q&A on a rolling basis during presentations. You can send your questions in writing, and we will ask them, I suppose, after each section, and we will have more time at the end for Q&A. If there's any issue with sound quality or slides, also please send us a private message, and we'll attend to that. A couple of words about 427 before I turn it over to Niels. Some of you know us already, but some of you may not. We are the leading provider of climate intelligence for financial markets. We've been in operations for exactly 6 years now, focused on translating climate data and climate science for business and investors, working across the board with financial institutions as well as corporations, real estate investors, development banks, and governments. We are based in Berkeley, California, where it's bright and early here today, but also have offices in Washington, D.C. and Paris, France. We're delighted to host this webinar jointly with GeoFi and to tell you more about our new offering in the real estate space. Without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Niels, to tell us about GeoFi and why are we here talking about climate risk in the real estate sector.
Thank you, Emily. Good morning, everybody. My name is Niels Cox, Chief Economist at GeoFi and Associate Professor in Finance and Real Estate at Maastricht University. Just very briefly about GeoFi, I put a tagline there. We want to understand value for every building in the world. We are building automated valuation models for the commercial real estate space. And while that may seem only remotely connected to climate risk, how we get to our automated valuation models is by collecting lots of property data with sales transactions, and we do that within others from REIT portfolios. We append to that contextual data, including climate risk data, and then apply machine learning to ultimately get to accurate fair market value for commercial real estate assets. You'll see some of our clients here. So let's talk about climate risk. On the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So we wrote a blog fairly recently titled "Who Cares About Climate Risk?" And while we may have some self-selection today of you dialing into this webinar, so probably interested or intrigued by climate risk, I don't think it's a given for many investors that climate risk is relevant. So just some examples for those based in the US, Florence, Michael, Willa, a number of hurricanes that came across and are still coming. This hurricane season, a typhoon Mangkhut, not just in the Philippines, but also Hong Kong, examples of storms and subsequent flooding, but also drought. And I put California here, but Australia is in the middle of a prolonged drought period. Europe is in the middle of a prolonged drought period. So again, not just California. Wildfires, well published what the damage that created in Northern California. And then an example that is directly related to climate risk, which is tidal flooding. So even though there's no storm passing through, you still get wet feet in the streets of Miami nowadays. So real estate investors should start to care about climate risk because buildings are, I would say, sitting ducks, and they can't really move when some of these events happen. So to, on the next slide, put climate risk in a bit more abstract way, and I'm an economist, so I like these kinds of graphs, but think about these distributions as, let's say, a temperature or a weather distribution. And what we see is that the impact of climate risk and climate change has two pronounced effects. So on the left-hand side, what you see is that the tail is shifting up. And what that means is that events that we expect and that insurance companies expect only every 100 years or 250 years are now happening every 10 years or every 5 years. And the intensity is increasing. So we get fat tail risks. And remember the black swan. We get fat tail risks as they relate to climate risk. They're infrequent, but have a high impact and have direct consequences for emergency preparedness. And on the right-hand side, you see the shift of climate. So think about increasing temperatures or increasing levels of precipitation. I call that boiling the frog. This doesn't happen overnight. Temperatures are not going to double overnight. So like a frog in a pan, he's not going to jump out when you start to heat the water. We're not jumping off the earth when the earth is heating up. But we see that climate shift happening slowly. And what we need to do there is adaptation. So just very briefly, what does this mean for real estate investors on the next slide? For direct investors, you need to start thinking about climate risk from an underwriting perspective and from a portfolio risk management perspective. So the real prudent investor won't just currently look at its portfolio, but also at acquisition and underwriting stage, think about climate risk, where the extent to which an asset is exposed to climate risk doesn't necessarily mean a no-go, but you want to start to integrate that into, for example, your CapEx plans. On the portfolio risk management side, if you haven't done it before, it's time for a strategic asset review. And then at a more tactical level, think about local mitigation plans where you have customized action plans for individual assets. And of course, exposure to risk has many elements: the short versus long-term paradigm, ownership horizon, insurability. We'll talk about it towards the end of the webinar. Now, this is very much focused on direct real estate investors. But many of you, whether it's private or from a business perspective, are exposed to real estate in an indirect way. So if you think about real estate, professional real estate investors include REITs, real estate investment trusts, but also CMBS, so commercial mortgage-backed securities that bundle loans that finance commercial real estate. That's a fixed income product. So REITs and CMBS are a very important part of the financial market. They're big parts of the financial markets, and organizations like a BlackRock, for example, have significant exposure to REITs via their ETFs. So if you think about climate risk, it's not just for direct real estate investors that is something to consider, but it's also something for indirect investors that invest in REITs and CMBS. And when Hurricane Florence came, you'll see that on the next slide, it was very interesting to actually understand how Hurricane Florence affected the assets that are owned by both REITs and CMBSs, and you can see that on the next slide. Yeah, so this is an example. Recent hurricane off the East Coast in the United States. So let's talk about 427 and GeoFi and a new climate risk product.
Thank you, Niels, and I'll jump back in here. So the good news is GeoFi and 427 shared a diagnosis of what was needed in the market, a comprehensive science-driven assessment of risk embedded in those listed products, REITs and CMBS, starting from an asset level analysis. So looking at property level assessment, all 73,600 properties that Niels just mentioned GeoFi has in the database, we've jointly developed a product that provides a view on how those different entities and each of their properties are exposed to climate risk. We're very excited about this partnership, which leverages best-in-class real estate market data and climate risk analysis and provides new insights into future impacts of climate change and current impacts of climate change on the real estate market. So we'll tell you a little more about that. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Nick Steinberg, who will tell you more about our methodology of how we measure and analyze climate risk at the site level.
Thanks, Emily. Now let's start at the beginning with the climate data and how exactly that's applied to measure physical impacts of climate change. Here at 427, we leverage a suite of publicly available climate models or global circulation models. Now, a few key characteristics about climate models before we jump into the scoring and the hazards of which we use for physical risk. They're big, they're complex, they cover the globe, and they do it at a resolution that's not particularly helpful. But their main intent is to simulate the natural environment under climate charged conditions. So that means more moisture, higher temperature, and all the other relative associated climate drivers that are pushing us towards increased averages and increased frequency and severity of extremes. So resolution is a very important piece of this. We utilize downscale climate models, which is a fancy way of saying topographically and hydrologically informed, so meaning they're taking the natural features of the local area and they're incorporating that into the model so that they can better simulate changing variables over a very diverse landscape. So once we've unpacked these large climate data files, resolved them to a high resolution, we're then looking at 2 centuries of information, sometimes displayed even at a daily time interval. So we've found that there's a sort of sweet spot in this mid to near term, somewhere around 2030 to 2040, at which time we have enough information from the global climate models to have a relatively high confidence baseline where there's more limited bias. But it's also the time horizon that's very relevant for business interests. It's more of an investment time horizon. So once we've settled in on this decade, we're able to really pin down a specific place and a specific time and measure those variables to see what the relative change has been from the historic period. Now, picking up on what Niels was referring to when we were talking about shifts in average and shifts in extreme, what's a really important risk factor when we're looking at climate change is the relative change from historical baselines. So that really means in terms of percentages, in terms of days, in terms of degrees, what's the difference we're seeing in the natural environment day to day from the historic period? And there's really 2 ways of measuring that. You can look at averages over time, which does have some material effect if you're running a building that relies on electricity, or you're looking at extreme events. So things that might be evident in the tail end of the distribution, so relatively material or extreme 95th percentile events statistically, things that might cause or induce some sort of impact. And this can manifest through all sorts of variables that are relatively tied to climate change, everything from rainfall to temperature. And they tend to appear in terms of their extent. So spatially, they might occur in areas that never previously experienced a large extreme event, or in areas that are relatively susceptible to, let's say, high rainfall or higher temperature. We're going to see more extreme events in those areas. Now, we take a look at 5 or 6 key climate hazards that are strongly tied to changes in the natural environment charged by climate change. So we're looking at everything from heat stress to extreme rainfall to flood risk over the actual landscape, larger events that are more coastal, such as sea level rise and coastal flooding, or cyclones, and as well as water stress, so drought-related conditions. Now, we do this at different resolutions for every hazard, and Kendall, my colleague, will speak to how we measure these differently for each hazard, but the resolution tends to be anywhere from 25 kilometers at the largest spatial scale, all the way down to about 90 meters when we're looking at floods, because it's so site-specific. Now, we leverage a lot of public data sources, everything from IPCC to NASA models, all the way to some more hydrological data sets from World Resources Institute, and we do have partners that have incorporated some information about tidal gauges, about physical floods and topography. So when we group all of these public and private data sources together, we're really able to measure over time what this really means. We've also selected an RCP scenario, which is consistent with our current emissions pathway and assumes a worst case scenario in line with a risk approach. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Neil to speak to some of the GeoPhi methods on their side.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. So I want to briefly talk about the REIT data that we collect, and we want to talk about the CMBS data today. We'll save that for a future webinar. So the data types that we're looking at as a company are, from a public perspective, CMBS data, and then REIT and property company data. And then there's other sources like banks, lenders, institutional clients, county tax records, etc. If you zoom in on REITs and property companies, and I use those combined because not every property company is a REIT. That's semantics, but I think it's important to highlight. Most of these companies make public their holdings through a variety of sources. So it's a bit of digging and data extraction from electronic feeds. It's the 10Ks and 10Qs, so the SEC reporting, it's annual reports, and then prospecti, and for CMBS remittance reports. And then for some REITs, we have direct feeds from the REITs themselves on what is in their portfolio. And what's in there is quite substantial. So on the next slide, you'll see what this ultimately amounts to worldwide. REITs at this point own about 74,000 commercial assets. And what's important there is that I don't count the single-family assets that are owned by BUWOG in, for example, Germany, or Invitation Homes in the United States. You'll see where this data is distributed. It's really the developed markets, Tier 1 Asia, Japan, Australia. That's where the highlights are, and then a bit in Brazil and a little bit in South Africa. So it's mostly developed markets. And on the next slide, you see how this distributes across the US. And our estimate is that if you compare the private equity market to the REIT market, that they're about 50-50. So the REIT market really has substantial coverage of the commercial real estate space. In terms of exact details, on the next slide, we cover, and this is changing obviously from quarter to quarter, given that the number of listed property companies or REITs changes from quarter to quarter, mergers, acquisitions, privatizations, as well as IPOs. We're currently 321 equity REITs. They hold a grand total of about 74,000 assets. That's 12 billion square feet and a market cap of $1.7 trillion US. So it's really quite substantial. And as you can hear, I like the REIT space. REITs are also their own industry within the GICS industry classifications. On the next slide, you see a quick distribution across property types. So diversified are REITs that hold more than a single property type. So it could be office and industrial together. But you see that all the major food groups are really represented here: retail, office, lodging, industrial, etc. But also globally, and you see that on the next slide, the US is the largest chunk, but then what you see is that the UK and some major Asian markets, as well as European markets, are well represented in the data. So what we end up with is an asset list of 74,000 assets that then goes into the capable hands of 4 to 7 to ultimately produce our product.
Thank you so much, Niels. And now, drum roll, the question is, how do things pan out when it comes to climate risk? I'll turn it over to Kendall Starkman to present us with the findings from our white paper on climate risk in the REITs.
Hi, my name is Kendall Starkman. I am on the 427 team, and I'm going to talk through a white paper that we've recently published that kind of applied the information that we've talked you through to an initial assessment of what this looks like in the REIT market. And so our key findings are really about bringing all of this data together to look at what is the physical climate risk across REIT portfolios globally. And this graph here on this slide actually does a really great job of showing you the high level average risk at the REIT level, both in terms of score, which is our y-axis, as well as highlighting those that have a large proportion of facilities that are in the highest or in the 95th percentile of risk for things we designate as red flag. And so you can see here that there's a large band of red towards the top, and that is a lot of the risk that's concentrated in Japan and Hong Kong, and comprises many of the Asian REITs in the portfolio that we analyzed. But there's also a few red dots that come in further down on the scoring list, and those are the REITs that might have a not as high of an average score, but have a large proportion of their facilities that come up in the 95th percentile of risk in our assessment. So you can see that across this wide range of data and information, the 320 REITs that we're looking at, over 73,000 facilities, there's a lot of nuance in this information, even looking at a high level. And so what we are able to do with this information is take a look at a number of different levels of information, both geographically, by facility type, and then even down to the facility level to get a number of different looks at where the risk is in this market. So I'll be able to help walk us through that. And just to also talk through, we dug into most specifically 3 of the hazards that we analyzed at 427 in this specific discussion, namely sea level rise, flood, and hurricanes and typhoons. So looking from a geographic perspective, we were able to highlight key markets. And so this is a visual of key markets exposed to sea level rise in the United States. And these are the 50 largest markets in the US. And there's a few obvious ones that come up for sea level rise, San Francisco and New York among them, as well as a couple places in Florida. But also notable are Charleston, South Carolina, and Virginia Beach and Norfolk, Virginia, where there's a large amount of risk, even though the market isn't as large as those larger markets. We're also able to take a look at the REIT level, and when we were looking at sea level rise, honed in on some of the highest value REITs and what their exposure to sea level rise risk is. And a lot of them, as we discussed earlier, many of the REITs that come up as very high risk are in Asia and Hong Kong and Japan. But some key US markets that are high on the list are in New York, San Francisco, and Washington, DC, which affects Vornado and Equity Residential. We also then are able to dig in at the facility level, as I said, and looked specifically at events that we knew had had an impact on the market. And so looking at Hurricane Harvey, we were able to see like a nuanced look at which sites are most vulnerable to flood, and then see how that correlated with impacts to REITs that we've already know what their damage was from that specific event. And so, for example, American Homes for Rent reported $20.1 million in damages from Hurricane Harvey, over half of which was covered by insurance claims. But what we're able to do in this analysis is take a look and see, okay, which facilities are at have higher exposure to future flood occurrence, and take a look at where they might be at risk going forward. When looking at hurricanes and typhoons, Japanese REITs really come up as the highest exposed sites. There's 37 Japanese REITs with high exposure, and a large percentage and proportion of the red flag properties for hurricanes and typhoons, those in the 95th percentile of risk, come up in Tokyo or Japan itself with over $260 billion at risk. But it's pretty critical to take a look also and consider the resilience and preparedness in different locations across the globe. So for example, the building code in Japan is pretty strong, so they're able to withstand more of this risk than an exposure than might be true in other places.
Thank you, Kendall, for this view on how climate change affects REITs globally. Before we move on to the next section, we'll take a couple of minutes and see if we have questions coming in. And it looks like we're answering in writing, or can you read it?
Sure, we have a question from Ronald Granite. Question is population growth, densification, and overdevelopment ever considered in these climate change or impact models? Do we look at an ecosystem and assess whether continued development past any sort of eco threshold? This is a great question. Population growth and urbanization trends are integrated into the climate change scenarios. Though these estimates are not explicit, they're rather baked into the simulations that are based on emission pathways and socioeconomic pathways, of which I can provide a link to. Our water stress measures also utilize population growth and urbanization trends to look at water demand in the decades ahead at a watershed level. However, the threshold exceedances that you speak to, we don't design those specifically around ecosystems. These are statistical in nature, so we're looking at exceedances of historical 90, 95th, 99th percentile, or known flood thresholds that are going to speak to material impacts economically, but also to the local area, so somewhat implicit.
Thank you. Nick, can you read those questions? Yeah.
Sure, yes. So the next question is, what would you have REITs do with this information?
So I'll take a quick pass, and Niels, I'm sure you have some views about that as well. There's a number of things that, and we'll get a little bit to that in the next set of slides as well. There's a number of things that REITs and investors can do with this information. The first one is just understanding where the risk is to feed decisions around due diligence and investments, around portfolio management, but also around CapEx investment in sites or certain retrofitting and decisions. So there's decisions that can be made at the asset level, at the portfolio level, and strategically in terms of macroeconomic outlook and where to invest that can be informed by those views. And we'll get back to that in a second. Niels, did you want to speak to that question as well?
Yeah, so, and I'll pick up another question as well. So to me, this is a first assessment, risk assessment that any real estate owner, whether it's a REIT or private equity firm, should do. And based on the outcomes, you can prioritize further screening, so type 2 or phase 2 assessment at the local level, which may then lead to implementation of climate risk mitigation plans as they relate, for example, flooding, or as they relate, for example, to exposure to storms. So it's that first phase 1 assessment. Also take another question that I see here. Obviously, question is, if you look at pricing and climate risk, do we already see that back in commercial real estate prices? There's a small number of studies on the impact of different types of climate risk on real estate prices. Most of it is on the residential market, not just in Florida, but looking at the impact of storms and rising sea level, or the prospect of that on the resi market. There's a great Journal of Financial Economics paper that finds that there's this average decrease in price of 7% for properties that are prone to flood risk, controlling for everything you can control for. On the commercial real estate side, there's only one paper done by my colleague Piet Eichholz at Maastricht University, where he looks at the impact of hurricanes or storms in New York and Boston on property prices, mostly following Sandy, and finds that indeed in the short run, property prices or cap rates are affected for flood-prone properties, and that obviously, as you may expect in financial markets, rebounds after about 5 years. And then there's obviously on the equity side, there's quite some research on the impact of climate risk events on equity prices that has not been done for REITs yet.
Great, thank you so much. There's 2 more questions we're going to take. One is a clarification question, and I'm going to go back to this slide here. Someone asking why San Diego, California shows up as not exposed to sea level rise. So I want to clarify what this map is showing. This map shows the number of REIT-owned properties in each city. So the size of the dot represents the number of facilities in that city. And the color represents the number of those specific sites that are exposed to sea level rise. So it so happens that properties owned by REITs in San Diego are not exposed to sea level rise just because of where they are in the city and the fact that the business district is just a little away. Whereas San Diego as a city generally, and certainly the waterfront, is very exposed to sea level rise, but this is not where the properties owned by REITs are. Kendall, you want to add something?
Yeah, and just to clarify, the larger green dot that is above the San Diego label, that's representing Los Angeles.
But the same argument applies to Los Angeles.
Exactly. So the coastal properties are at risk because there is a lot of inland property that is not exposed to sea level rise. It doesn't average out as much. The yellow dot that's down there in the corner is San Diego, so it does average out to a bit of a risk indicator.
There are a number of properties exposed. Thank you. The other question that came up, and that is a longer conversation that could take us the rest of the hour, is the role of insurance and whether we anticipate any impact on insurance premiums from those hazards. The short answer is yes, but it's not quite clear yet how things are going to pan out. We are seeing anecdotal evidence of impacts on insurance prices or availability in certain markets. There was a little bit of a controversy in California recently around the availability of insurance for wildfires after the series of wildfires that we experienced here. And a number of property owners who reported being dropped off by their insurance companies. So there's a broader question of whether the world will remain insurable, whether certain regions and areas will remain insurable. The short-term view is that as long as your asset is insured, you're fine. How long will insurance companies be able to withstand an increase in frequency and intensity of events, and how long will they provide insurance services for certain areas is a broader question that needs to be factored in. Do we have one more question, or are we just? Okay, yeah. So let's move on to the next piece, and that will allow us to talk a little more about our use cases for investors. One of the use cases near and dear to my heart is how to integrate those considerations into TCFD reporting and Article 173 reporting if you're in France. Many of you knows, I am sure, that the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has recommended that investors and corporations report on the climate-related risk that they hold in their portfolio of assets. That includes both transition risks, which has to do with energy and carbon emissions and how is the world going to change when we move away from fossil fuels, but also physical risk, broken down here as acute and chronic, which is probably a little simplified from our standpoint in terms of the range of impacts from physical climate change. We'll get back to that in a second, as well as opportunities. And there can be opportunities in there as a differentiator as well for investors to really hold a portfolio of assets that are particularly resilient or geared to withstand certain conditions. I want to focus here a little bit on the metrics and targets. So TCFD essentially asks investors to report on governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And if you look at the questions, the guidance provided around those first three categories, they are very applicable to physical climate change. It's a matter of answering those with in mind, not just sustainability, energy efficiency, but also thinking about resilience and risk management. And whether to answer these questions directly, their manifestation into some of the reporting initiatives out there, the PRI, CDP, or answering the GRESB resilience module, which maps to a lot of those questions as well. There's a lot of ways to do that. Where we've found our clients and partners sometimes struggle a little more is when it comes to metrics and targets, where the TCFD recommendations were very focused on carbon and energy related issues, not so much on physical risk. So I want to take a step back here and also hopefully answer that earlier question of what are we talking about when we're talking about building resilience? And we tend to see it as a three-layered cake, if I may. First layer is simply thinking about the physical resilience of the assets. So whether the building and the materials that it's made of, the design specifications that it's built to will resist certain conditions that, as we've seen, will change over time. And that's probably where the sort of the first step and a very engineering focused approach. There's another consideration, which is thinking about the many things that the asset depends on to function, right? Is there going to be water, electricity, telecom? Is there going to be transportation? Are tenants going to be able to come in and out? Are there going to be changes? So hospitals are a great example because their fundamental use is affected by climate hazard. So one example here is, are hospitals prepared for an inflow of people during extreme weather events? There's been a ton of stories about unfortunate disasters during recent hurricanes around the ability of hospitals to deal with the situation. And that takes me to the third layer in a way, which is how can the asset be of service to the community and not just withstand, right? You don't want to be a fortress with sandbags all around. The example of Goldman Sachs, the Goldman Sachs building during Hurricane Sandy being the only one lit up in lower Manhattan while public hospitals were being evacuated. It was good preparedness on the one hand, on the other it was terrible PR, right? And beyond the PR and the reputational damage, there's a component of just serving the community and serving tenants and stakeholders. And so thinking about how the asset can also be a safe harbor and provide resilience dividends to the community. And so keeping those, keep those in mind as we continue to think through emerging practices for TCFD reporting. And I've humbly titled the slide Emerging Practices, not Best Practices, because this is new for everybody. A lot of people are thinking hard about those questions and trying to do their best to answer, to follow TCFD recommendations and answer expectations from their investors, but there isn't a how-to yet on how to do that. However, I did want to point a number of resources and provide some pointers as to how to think about those issues. Couple of resources. On resilience, generally, I want to flag the new website from the Urban Land Institute that has a ton of great examples on how land developers are integrating and building projects that are particularly resilient and bring a lot of benefits to the community. That's available here, developingresilience.uli.org. GRESB, I will let Chris do the talking that's coming up in a couple of slides, but that's of course a key resource for the sector. I want to point out this white paper here that is a work in progress, but a preview of the white paper was released a couple of weeks ago at the ULI full meeting. That is written by ULI and Heitman, the real estate asset manager, that is putting a lot of thoughts and efforts into understanding how the market is responding to physical impacts from climate change, how the market is future-proofing for those impacts, and includes a very thoughtful table on the different impacts of climate risk and their impact on real estate. I included a little sample here. The rest is available online on Heitman's website as well as on ULI's website. Lastly, and I'll speak a little more to that piece, the Global Center on Adaptation and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development have been putting a lot of efforts on trying to advance TCFD guidance on physical climate risk and opportunities. This is a report that we co-authored for them together with partners in Europe, and where we laid out a set of recommendations on how corporations can include physical climate risk in their reporting. And while the report is focused on corporations, which are somewhat more complicated beasts maybe than real estate itself, it does cover real estate. And I just wanted to flag a few elements here that might be useful. The recommendations that stand out, the first recommendation is simply to actually do a risk assessment, to assess the exposure to all climate impacts. And there is a larger table that covers how different sectors are more or less affected by climate risk. And I just snapped here the piece on real estate, which, as Niels noted, has its own GIGS category, and the type of risk that were highlighted in the report for real estate firms to assess and report to their investors. Don't want to get too much into details. There's considerations around what time frame to use, looking forward, but also looking backward and trying to understand from past events and from the history of changes in weather conditions over the past 5 years, to understand the magnitude of the financial impact. And this really goes back to one of the questions earlier on how climate change already affects the stock market, and analysis that we hope to develop over time now that we have this data. Last piece here is some example of metrics that can be included, and this goes back to my breakdown earlier of thinking about properties, not just as a building, but also in terms of how they interact with our markets. And so thinking about risks and opportunities to the properties, as well as to the markets globally, thinking about risk and thinking about risk management and resilience strategy. Again, all the slides will be available, and these are discussion points, not hard and fast rules, but really meant to help empower investors to start integrating climate change into their reporting. With that, I will turn it over to Chris Pikes from GRESB, who can tell us more about how GRESB is thinking about those issues and integrating climate risk into the resilience module.
Hi, Emily, thank you so much. You can go to the next slide, please. Great. So for folks who may not be familiar, GRESB regards itself as the global benchmark for real assets. It was founded by Nils and colleagues at Maastricht University with the intention to meet the needs of institutional investors. And so GRESB's mission as an organization is to enhance and protect shareholder value, and by understanding environmental, social governance, and sustainability practices. GRESB has grown a lot. So for those of you who may not be entirely familiar, GRESB exclusively covers real assets in the ESG space. And if you take a look, that basically since 2009, it's grown to cover nearly 900 companies and funds in the space. Those companies and funds cover about 79,000 assets and about $3.5 trillion in asset value. So you go to the next slide for a second. To give you a sense of, the context for the results I'm going to be talking to you about in a moment, GRESB coverage is global. Roughly 60% of the listed real estate universe is currently reporting to GRESB, and you get a sense of that global coverage that the majority of the participants numerically are in Europe, the highest performing participants are in Australia and New Zealand, and the greatest value of the participants are in the North American market. So give you a sense of this roughly parallels, as Nils showed us earlier, the REIT space globally. This is a fair approximation of that entire market. If you go to the next slide for a second. The remarks I wanted to share with you guys today is that in line with what we've heard so far, GRESB over the last year has elected to focus, has tracked these issues of increasing concern regarding climate risk and resilience, and starting at the end of last year, convened on behalf of its members an effort to increase the number of indicators and metrics related to resilience that are available through the GRESB assessment, and an optional supplement called the GRESB Resilience Module. So together, the core GRESB assessments for property companies and funds and the Resilience Module provide over 150 discrete data elements. And as Emily mentioned earlier, our emphasis has been increasingly on aligning those data elements with recommendations from the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. That includes looking at elements of how companies and funds are governed, how they are managing risk, how that risk translates into business strategy, and ultimately the kinds of performance metrics that they track and report to their investors. If you go to the next slide for a moment, I want to give you a sense of who is participating. So as I mentioned, there are, when we look at the total number of real estate respondents, we had about 113 entities specifically participate in both the core assessments and the optional resilience module. So this gives us a first look at the most engaged property companies and funds around the world on the topic of climate risk and resilience. Just one quick insight into who these 113 companies are. These companies are, they do span, they are global in their nature. They represent all the major markets. However, they are slightly overrepresenting North America and the Australia-New Zealand market. Europe and Asia are slightly underrepresented. So we do have representation and coverage. However, we do have a bit of overrepresentation from those two markets. If you go to the next one for a second. I wanted to offer you a few quick highlights from the resilience module and the associated core assessment data, just to give you a taste. And I am going to leave you hanging just a little bit that GRESP released some of the resilience results back in September, but we are releasing a comprehensive 50+ page report on this topic coming up in November. I'll tell you more about that in a second. So, but I wanted to give you a couple of highlights. First and foremost, when it comes to leadership, one of the key issues is how are property companies and funds addressing this issue? One of the most foundational issues that's recognized by the TCFD guidelines is the issue of governance and leadership. And so probably not surprisingly, 90% of these respondents report having a senior employee with specific responsibility for resilience. This provides a point of leadership within their organization. Roughly half of these responsible folks are the same individual who has responsibility for sustainability and ESG. However, the other half of these entities is someone else, a chief resilience officer, a risk officer, or someone else. So the bottom line is that of this 113 companies, the vast majority, almost all of them, have a key connected responsible party. Half of them are the sustainability professional, half of them are someone else. Go to the next slide for a second. At the same time, as Emily informed us a few minutes ago, one of the key issues that TCFD recommends is the assessment of physical risks. And what we did in the module was ask these property companies and funds both about what kinds of risks they were assessing, and critically how it related to either physical stressors, shocks. In this context, we're using stressors to indicate chronic stress in the parlance of TCFD, and shocks to indicate acute issues. The bottom line is that over 90% of participants reported at least some asset level risk assessment for physical environment or stressors, long-term stressors. The predominant concern was on business continuity and asset value. We saw a high level, but less concern as to tenant operations, and then a lower level on community impact or individual impact. If you look at the escalation, we see a high level of engagement around physical and physical stressors, environmental stressors, hydrologic shocks, meteorologic shocks, exactly the kinds of things that the team has told you about today. We see a lower level of engagement on related things like social stressors or social disruption, with only half of companies and funds reporting systematic risk assessment in those areas. The bottom line is that companies and funds, at least the 113 that responded to this assessment, are beginning to take concrete and tangible action to assess climate risk. They're focused on business continuity. They're focused on asset value disruption. Go to the next slide, please. And I wanted to give you an overall picture. I think one of the key insights from this assessment of these 113 companies was that there really is a tale of to some degree, of two markets. What we did is we looked at the comprehensiveness of responses to these categories of governance, risk assessment, business strategy, and performance metrics. And we were able to identify, we segmented the market based on the comprehensiveness of the responses. And I would like to call your eye to just one quick highlight, or two contrasting highlights. One is across the bottom, these are quartiles of the market. So the highest quartile of the market, the most comprehensive programs, are they were providing affirmative positive responses to over 75% of the indicators that we identified. And there is actually fairly low variance around those companies around the world. So essentially nobody was doing everything we asked, but the top quartile was a tight band of folks doing at least 75% of the available indicators. On the other end of the spectrum, the lowest quartile was a wide, high variance group that was doing on average 12% of the programs. So the key insight for both investors and stakeholders in these companies is that in this self-selected group of early adopters, the top of the market has begun to implement comprehensive, multifaceted plans to assess climate and transition risk. On the other hand, even among these self-selected group, we see that there is a large fraction who are implementing less comprehensive programs. And to be clear, less comprehensive doesn't necessarily mean less relevant or less or higher risk. However, there are questions about why maybe all of the elements, all the recommendations from TCFD are not yet being implemented. There may be good reasons for that, maybe not. This is a point of engagement for engaged investors. If you can go to the next slide, please. Just to wrap up, I wanted to give you just a quick glimpse into where we're heading with this. As I mentioned, these highlights, both for the interest of time and for the interest of saving the punchline for November, we will be reporting a deep dive on the report from the entire GRESP universe in November. We'll be convening a technical working group to revise our resilience module. As Emily mentioned, we have learned a ton in the last year since we created the resilience module, and we expect we will release a revised resilience module with a greater emphasis on filling gaps with TCFD and increasing emphasis on performance metrics and scenario analysis. It will be released as a document in February. It will be available for use by property companies and funds around the world on April 1st of next year. And so we're looking forward to that. Go to the next and final slide. So finally, I wanted to give you a sense of how to learn more. If you'd like to see what we've done so far, you can follow the link to the, or follow this hyperlink to learn more about the resilience module and take a look at the preliminary results. You can also follow me or contact us for more information on the results and when they're going to be available in November. So I appreciate the chance to share this with you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today and sharing those insights. We look forward to the full report. We have a lot of questions coming in. I do have 2 more slides that I want to share with the group, and then we'll take some of those questions given time. We may not be able to get to all of them, and we'll try to answer in writing, or please feel free to follow up. So a couple of, and that answers some of the questions that have been coming in. If you are interested in learning more about those data sets or acquiring them, we do work with a range of financial institutions, REIT investors, REIT managers, real estate investors in non-listed portfolios, and we have solutions for the different needs, ranging from packaged data with scores for the entire universe of REITs, either scores at the REIT level or the detailed underlying data set of exposure of each of the properties. Working with REITs, we understand that you may not need the full universe, so we have packages around the assessment of your specific portfolios. And then I want to point out that we also provide bespoke analysis of portfolio of properties. So if you have a portfolio of real estate site, we can do this analysis for you and score it and benchmark it against the broader real estate universe. So there's value in there in being able to understand how your assets compare to the rest of the universe of properties globally. We can also help with thinking more broadly about impacts on key markets and thinking about strategic decisions around which areas, cities, countries might be better prepared and better positioned to deal with those impacts over time. And I have just a couple of screenshots here of examples of the type of analysis that we provide for our clients with real estate portfolios. So with that, I suggest we turn it back to questions. Natalie, do you want to?
Yeah, we have a few questions about the practical implications of these risk analytics. So one is, how are these results and the TCFD guidance being internalized into organizational policies and day-to-day practices and investments? And that goes along with, what are the commercial implications of climate risk and where and how to modify underwriting of assets?
Thank you. I'll provide some elements, and Niels would love to hear from you, Chris, as well, if you have elements of answers. What we've seen in our experience working with clients is that these are really the early days of working through those topics. We have seen a couple of thought leaders who are already having set processes on how they deal with climate change. I was on a panel with a gentleman from Kempen last week who was saying how they systematically apply the 10% discount on properties that they think is exposed to climate change using a similar type of data and projections as the one we presented today. We know of a number of other institutions that are actively thinking through for themselves how they want to integrate, how they want to report those risks, how they want to set up processes over time. So again, going back to, this is early in the process. This is a co-discovery effort in a way where we provide the risk assessment and then work with our client in thinking through what that means for them and how they can integrate it. And I just want to flag that the expectations from the TCFD and investors is not that you're going to have 100% of their answers tomorrow, but rather to understand how you're thinking about those issues and starting to show, at least from a qualitative standpoint, how you can make connections between having a percentage of your portfolio exposed and thinking about how you're going to deal with that over time. So work in progress. Where we're lucky again is that the thought leaders that are working on those issues are being very, for the most part, they're being very public and sharing their learnings as they progress. And so this is something that we can all learn from together. Niels or Chris, anything you'd like to add to this question?
Yeah, just briefly at the two different levels, at the level of the security investor, so either the REIT investor or the fixed income or general equities investor, this data is and will be used for engagement in the same way that general ESG data has been used in the past. Now this is quantitative information, so it's useful for equity investors to have quantitative information as a means of engagement with REITs or portfolios that have a higher level of exposure to climate risk. And not unlike what we've seen in the ESG space, it will be the forward-looking sovereigns, pension funds, active investors that will take the lead on this, certainly the Europeans, but also the more specialized SRI investors in the US. At the asset level, I mean, we've incorporated, or the sector has incorporated flood risk assessments for a long time, and obviously assets that are exposed. You want to have insurance in place, either as an investor or as a lender. So this is not totally new. I think it's just an extension of the fairly simplistic view we've been taking when it comes to climate risk, which is just looking at a FEMA map. And I think that's not going to be sufficient going forward, given the changes that are taking place and the changes that will happen over the next 5 to 25 years.
Niels, very briefly, I'll just to suggest a resource. If folks want to learn more about what leading practices look like, we have a recorded webinar on the GRESB Insight webpage that provides firsthand perspectives from Forest City, Boston Properties, and Parkway about how they are incorporating both climate risk assessment and climate-related information into their development process, both as a risk mitigation exercise and a value creation exercise. So if folks are interested, I encourage them to search on resilience on GRESB Insight and look for that recording that's readily and freely available.
Thank you, Chris. And on this question, as well as a number of others asking for references about the papers that Niels mentioned on the impacts of climate hazards on the market, we'll add a slide with links at the end of the deck, and you can and you can refer to those for further information. I think we'll take one more question, and then we'll bring this to a close as we're coming to the top of the hour.
Great. This question is, does anyone have any examples of entities that have recently begun requiring additional climate risk analytics? Lenders, regulators, cities and municipalities, insurers, investors?
And so the answer is yes to all of the above. And I want to say that what I said earlier about the real estate sector is true for all of these categories here. We're seeing banks that are starting to look at their portfolios and trying to understand the risk that they hold, being really challenged because they don't necessarily know where the assets are. If you're in real estate, you know where you're located. If you're in other sectors, if you hold a portfolio of corporations, you don't necessarily know where their assets are. If they're SMEs, this is not public information necessarily. Regulators are banging at the door for this data. The Dutch National Bank is about to release a report on the impact of water risk on equities that was informed by our data on equities and water, so that's coming forth in the coming weeks. The Bank of England just issued regulations that was in the Financial Times last week. The French regulators are also actively looking at that, and the European Commission. Cities and municipalities, we have experience working with cities, and we're seeing also growing interest from credit rating agencies in better understanding how those hazards might affect municipalities' ability to repay their loans over time. Insurers, of course, are actively looking at those issues, but not yet quite sure how to incorporate that into pricing models, which are 1 year out and more focused on extreme events, but not quite set to capture chronic changes or long range changes like sea level rise. So we're seeing a lot of activity in that space, a lot of interest, and a lot of very smart folks trying to figure out what's the best way to integrate this data into their own decision processes. And I really want to invite you to share with us if you have best practices or reports or TCFD type reports. We would be happy to share and redistribute, feature those. And then please keep an eye on our website. We'll be publishing more analysis over time. And then final comment will be, there's many questions that we didn't get to. We'll try to answer as much as we can in writing over emails. And certainly any question with our data and the product, we'll reach out and continue that conversation offline. With that, I would like to thank our many panelists and thank all of you for staying on the line. And please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.